right, guys, welcome back to episode 4 of DP Deconstruct. We've had so many questions about S-Log over the years, and should I shoot S-Log, Cinetone, a Cine Gamma?
I literally had a phone call today,
and I had one 2 days ago.
Yeah.
So I would say we get asked this question at minimum every other week.
Sure.
Since we've been running this, and so we
want to
cover
it. It can be really intimidating. So
yeah, and so we thought it would be important to cover this one. DPs are wanting to know. It's not like Joe Schmo who just bought a camera only wants to know. There are a lot of DPs that this is a really intimidating topic to look into if you don't have a basic understanding of what 709 is, what is log, what is Cine Gamma versus Hyperlog,
and how it changes the way you shoot, the way you expose, all of those things. I mean,
because it's completely different. Yeah. So I think the first thing to cover is we are Sony guys. When we're saying S-Log, unless we're specifically speaking of the Sony of the S-Log profile or Cinetone,
just means log.
We're just talking log. We're just so used to saying S-Log that it's probably going to come out S-Log, and we're meaning it could be C-Log, it could be Z-Log, it could be whatever for whatever camera manufacturer that you run.
Yeah.
So let's start it off. 709.
Yeah.
Do you want to cover what?
Rec 709, a lot of times I think a lot of people are more familiar with picture formats and those things. When you take a picture on your phone, you have a JPEG format, and that's a deliverable format that can be read on anything. It's print ready, right? And so in the same way, that's kind of what Rec 709 is. And there's plenty of different wrappers, but everything's converted into a color space called Rec 709. It's a smaller space, but it's contrasty. It's, has a lot of pop and sharpness, and the color space is a little more refined, but really it's a deliverable video color space that's for broadcast. And so that's kind of like your final look. I would say 95% of the time, most people are delivering in unless it's very HDR specific, type of deal, you might put it in a different color space, but that's way beyond this video. And
we don't want to go too far.
Yeah, and so really, the short of it, Rec 709 is a deliverable color space for broadcast TV, your phone to YouTube, all of those things.
Right, yeah, that's what if you're delivering to a client, they're going to want that in the 709 color space.
Yep.
So do you want to go into why people are intimidated by S-Log?
Maybe just quick talk about what is log footage.
Yeah. Okay, so log footage, it's the reason that manufacturers put log capabilities into a camera is because it allows you to get the most out of that camera. But you're going to get more dynamic range. It's going to allow for, like I said, more color, 10-bit. If you have like an 8-bit log, it's not going to do near as much.
Yeah,
give you near as much latitude as what a 10-bit's going to give you, or a 12-bit or whatever. So,
and this isn't 100% science, but like if you can get your brain around it, is you have more control in post-production of log, and instead of your camera telling you the color, the sharpness, the contrast, all of those things. Yes, it's still recording in that color space, and the sensor itself is recording that, but you get to kind of pull it apart and really redirect those things a little bit more in post-production, in color grading. And that's a really dummy version of that. But you do have more control over that. And everything's squashed into a smaller space, and you really expand it in post-production. That's kind of the advantage of a log profile. Yeah,
you're able to, instead of the camera putting contrast and saturation and really a lot of color information into the shot itself, you're doing that in post.
Correct.
Through whatever program you use. Like you're manually doing that yourself.
And that's why it can be intimidating. You don't know, you're going, man, I get in post-production, I can never make it look like what I want. I actually like the Rec 709 out of the camera better than what I'm getting my footage. Right. And so they stay there because it's more comfortable, but really you're handicapping yourself in a lot of situations. And if, I would be as bold to say as I think it's always proper to shoot S-Log. And I would even say in live broadcast, and I'll get into that later on why I would do that, but there obviously would be a filter in between that. So
Alistair Chapman is like,
dude,
all things
in Sony. We're talking about Sony.
He knows more about Sony than just about anybody else that shoots, it seems like. And he does say that the new Cinetone, if you're shooting if you're going to be in a dark situation where you're not worried about your highlights, you're more concerned about retaining your shadows, your mids and your shadows, the information in those spaces, rather than having to worry about what's the knee of my shot doing, the knee, like how will my highlight roll off? Is that, if that's not even a concern, he says that it's better to shoot in Cinetone. But I think that it'd be better to lower your exposure index.
Well,
if you wanted to worry about,
I mean, we're going Sony specific here, but if you're talking about Cinetone has different characteristics on how it's exposed all the way through. So, you know, if you're underexposed, evenly exposed, or overexposed, it's going to have a completely different look. And why sometimes people are like, man, I can't get these two cameras to match.
It's because of exposure.
It's more of an exposure because of how the roll off things are. Anyway, that's completely different. But
yeah,
Cinetone,
sorry, I went like
Cinetone is a Rec 709 finish file that Sony has produced to make it look really good right out of camera ready.
Right.
And again, it's not that Cinetone's bad, but you're losing a stop of dynamic range. So maybe,
well, and that's why he said if you're not worried about your roll off, because you're losing a full stop of dynamic range. So if that's not a concern,
I guarantee you I'd have a million colorists that I know who would argue that factor. But
I agree. I'm just saying this is what Alistair says.
I'm just saying, like,
we have like,
I understand what he's saying, but anybody who really understands color would,
and you got to think too, Alistair's talking full production, right? He has the in mind his pre-production, production, post-production budget. Is there time for grading? Is there time for all this? And a lot of times there's no budget for grading. And so most people don't understand that S-Log is actually really, really easy to convert.
Yeah, it really is.
But we'll get into that in a little bit. I am jumping way ahead.
Dynamic range. What is it? Why is it important?
Why is it important is because the eye sees 33 stops of dynamic range. 33
stops of dynamic range.
I did not know that until about 3 months ago.
And I was like, hey, did you know?
Like, dude, I was looking up the other day to see what dynamic.
I'm a nerd. I love this. I mean, we've spent so many hours in color, but man, the more I learn, the more I'm fascinated.
The more you learn, the more you're like, I don't know anything.
The body is actually incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. But with the human eye sees in like 33 or 34 stops of dynamic range. The best cameras, well, there's a new Canon. But the best cameras, let's just say, except for anything that has been announced, not released, is 17 stops dynamic range, 17 and a half, something like that. So even the best camera doesn't get what the eye does, but dynamic range is the ability to retain your highlights.
Now, don't comment I'm sure there's some weird, crazy NASA camera that can see. But we're talking like
production camera.
Production camera.
Right. And so the ability to retain your highlight information while not losing and crushing all your blacks.
Yeah.
The more dynamic range your camera has, the more ability you're going to be able to retain all that information in your shot.
Insert graphic here. Like, all right, here's your dynamic range above exposure, below exposure.
You might do Google.
Yeah. Got to Google something. But like really, that's exactly it. Like when you say a step of dynamic range, it's so if even exposes here, how many stops of range do you have above even, and how many stops do you have in your shadows? So on your highs and your lows, like the dynamic range, obviously the more dynamic range, the more detail can, be caught in skies and highlights and specular and those kind of things. And then same things with shadows. Sometimes you want to purposely, crush those things and do those, but it's nice to have the option and the ability to do that later than
and it's always better as long as you still have the ability to retain your highlights. It's always better to overexpose footage. Yeah. Always. Never underexpose and then think I'm going to lift up my exposure in post.
To clarify that, expose your footage properly, but per scene, right? So yes, right. I've literally dealt with footage color grading that was the entire thing was underexposed, and then they're like, hey, bring this back, and then it's grainy and this, and it's like, it would be better if that was a stop overexposed. Always. And bring all that back because you have way more,
Well, and when you're if we get into exposure indexes, that's the whole reason for it, for EI.
Yeah.
But we're going to get all over the place. This is supposed to be a fast podcast.
Well, and I want to keep it basic. So let's keep it to log. Why?
Well, that's part of it. Part of the question on FX6 that I had, I don't know what you were having, but the question I had on the FX6 is, what is EI? Why does it even matter? And why wouldn't I shoot in Cinetone? Because Cinetone, it comes out of the camera ready to go.
Yeah.
And I think most of the people that I talk to, it comes down to a workflow issue and then not understanding exposure index versus
Yeah,
ISO.
for me, I think it's people don't understand what to do with log and post-production. And so because of that, they're fearful of shooting in it. But I try to tell people all the time, like, I mean, there really is, if you want Cinetone, there's pretty much a way to drag and drop and do that in post-production where you don't have to do a whole
literally
lot.
a full project. It will take 15 seconds in Premiere or in Davinci. I don't know Final Cut at all, but Premiere, Davinci, 15 seconds, and you're set.
Yeah.
No matter if it's S-Log footage, Canon log footage, Panasonic footage, it doesn't matter. It takes 15 seconds, and you're done for the whole project.
If you want to see the full abilities of log footage, in my opinion, go deal with DJI drone footage. Like, the difference between a Rec 709 baked in look and log is incredible what you can do in post-production and the difference.
If I have to mess with DJI footage that's been shot in 709, like that's out of the camera 709, and I see that, I'm just like,
oh, dude, and it's miserable.
It's not fun.
I
with
spend
log.
more time trying to fix that footage
Yeah.
than I do actually enjoying it. I think that's the joy of learning some of these things. In my opinion, if you are a DP and a regular director of photography, you should know your instrument inside and out. Your camera, your tool. The more you master that thing, the better DP you're going to be.
Right. And I will say there's always room to learn.
Yeah, and there is.
But you had better be far above what the average user knows if you're going to say that you're going to run your camera for a living even.
Yeah.
You know, it's not, if you're not a hobbyist,
yep,
you should know your camera very, very, very well. And that's more than just this button does this.
I hear people a lot who's like, oh yeah, man, I just haven't had time with it. I had to bring it on a shoot like, you know, the next day. And I'm like, dude, don't do that. Like you're not doing your customer justice.
The day you got your FX6, I think we had a shoot with it 3 or 4 days after you got it in.
Yeah.
And it was a 20-hour drive that we had to do. So like, but the day you got it, you stayed up almost all night.
Yeah.
And you were going through literally every menu item.
Yep.
And you called me at like 1 a.m, dude, guess what?
Yeah.
I just learned this about my camera. And you knew more within a week of having that camera than other people had known that had been running Sony cinema cameras for years and then had the FX6 for months.
I would feel horrible if I showed up to a job and I didn't actually, like, I've actually done that where I'm just a shooter and somebody gives me a new camera and all of a sudden I'm like, you know, it's like learning an entire new system in a matter of seconds. You're not comfortable. You're not confident. You're sitting here like, you know, fumbling around.
Well,
and you
fast.
do need to do that. Like you have to learn those things. And obviously the basics of all of your knowledge in photography and the things that you've learned come into play. But like if I'm charging somebody for their, you know, I'm going, hey, this is my time. This is my knowledge. I better do it justice that I've mastered that thing. And I'm not sitting here fumbling around with it or making decisions that compromise the end product because I haven't taken time to learn it. Like that's what we get paid to do. Like,
and we charge a premium. And so like, if we're going to charge a premium, we had better be able to offer a premium product and not waste time because at the end of the day, we charge however you set up your pricing. It's based off of how much am I worth per day or per hour? Like how much is my time worth? And so if they're paying you for your time, you shouldn't be fumbling with your camera or any piece of gear.
Yeah, and that is any piece of gear. I do that we talked about this lenses. I put it on my camera for a week. I learned the focal length. I learned the characteristics of the lens. I learn what I love about it and I don't like about it. I do that so that way when I'm on a job site and I'm on a shoot or wherever, I can go, I know that's the lens I want. I know that's the light I want. That's the camera I want. This is the reason I'm making those choices.
Usually before we get there.
All ultimately benefiting our clients. And I hope that they see that. And so with that being said, getting back to this whole idea, so, you know, I feel like the more control you have over your footage in the long term, whether you're handing that footage off or you're dealing with it yourself. Because right now there's a lot of indie filmmakers, there's production companies that are starting from start to finish, but you and I have been working on some really big productions where we hand our footage off. And there's times where they're like, hey, can you shoot this in a Rec 709, and we really will have at least a conversation with them to say, hey, I don't believe that's the best case scenario. If you want it in a Rec 709, we would rather shoot it in that. Let us, at least put a conversion on it into
we'll
Rec
have a
709.
phone call with you and talk about, hey, this is how you convert it.
Hey, pinch a little bit more out of your budget and let us color grade that thing.
Right, it's a little bit of a upsell.
But it's true, man. It makes the difference.
So I think that we should talk about, like, everybody that I've talked to, almost everybody I've talked to, their biggest fear is it's an additional workflow. It's going to add so much more time to my workflow, and it's going to make a project that I can do in 10 hours is going to make me take 3 days.
Yeah.
Like, that's a legitimate fear that people have.
And to be honest, like, until we started shooting in 10-bit, when we got 10-bit is really where we dove into color.
Right.
And when you dig into color, you're going, okay, how do I get the most out of my investment? Like, I own a Sony FX6. Like, if I'm just it's like buying a Ferrari and driving at 30 miles an hour the entire time. Like, what's the point, right? Like, there's a reason why you buy a better tool. And when I say we pushed, you know how many people saw our 8-bit footage and was like, did you guys shoot that on red? And we're like, no, this is shot this on an A7 III. And I feel like that's the big thing. Like, learn your tool to the full extent. And when you're fully utilizing that thing and it's hindering what you're wanting to do, is that kind of time for new investment, right?
Yeah, that's when it's time.
Yeah.
I think that we should go over the process beginning to end. I think the most important part about, if you're going to decide to shoot in Cine EI or in S-Log or whatever, if you're going to decide to shoot that, the most important thing about shooting in log is understand the camera. Mm-hmm. Know your settings, know what your exposure is supposed to be for different varying situations, because they're all different. Every shoot is different in some way. But understand, I am shooting this correctly.
Yeah.
And then from there on the back end, it makes it extremely easy.
Yeah. And that comes down to it. It's like, first, know your camera, know the ins and outs, know what it does and how it does, so that way you can really, the client's benefiting from all of those things.
Yeah.
And from that, again, I'll go to this. You just asked, like, what's the hesitancy of shooting S-Log? And the whole point of why I was getting into that, it was like, when we first started, that was our hesitancy of like, we're just kind of not got like in the look. Then all of a sudden you're A-Bing, you're like, it looked better before I started shooting S-Log.
Right.
Like, there's if you don't know how,
well, you're manually adding curves. You're manually you're turning up your contrast dial.
And you and I have the mentality, like, if you're not learning, you're really, backtracking.
You're falling
right?
behind,
like you're falling behind.
Because the space is always moving forward.
Yeah, and it's just getting out of control. You can't keep up with it, but you find your place and know where to stay in the game. And anyway, with that being said, that's where we stopped a little bit, took the time to learn. And I would say this, like, if that's your hesitancy, I would encourage you to experiment and to learn with S-Log. And the reason why is you're going to have way more retention in your highlights, and it's going to it allows you to have a little bit more forgiveness in your shooting. That should not be the reason you shoot in it, but it is nice to know, if I shot that in a finished profile and that's completely blown out in that window, in S-Log or in log footage in general, you have a little bit more ability to do that. So that's a benefit of log footage. And to go back into that, every single manufacturer of a camera provides something called a conversion LUT, or a color space transform. And what that means is they've created these incredible sensors, the A1, an incredible sensor, backlit, all of this technology. That's what you're paying for in this thing. And then they've took a lot of time to make that color look good, all of their things, and they know exactly the science of that. Every manufacturer provides a color space transform, or a LUT, better.
That's what most people understand as a LUT, yeah.
And they'll provide that from their website. You can download it, and whether you use Adobe Premiere, Davinci, or even Final Cut or whatever, you can literally in 15 seconds grade all of your log footage and put it into that Rec 709 space, yet you shot in a log, so you have more dynamic range to fumble around with.
And the difference in that is, a lot of people are going to be like, well, why does it matter if I'm just going to end up putting it on my timeline as a Rec 709 space anyway? Why does it matter? since you shot it in log, you retain all that information.
And you get to choose what you're doing with it.
Right. You can dial back your highlights. You can, you can pull more information out of your shadows because you have that information and it wasn't baked in.
Yeah.
Why don't we do this really quick? We're talking about if you learn this. Why don't we spend a few minutes going through the process of, well, how do I properly expose? Okay. How do I bring this into post processing? And then how do I deliver? Just snippet on delivery, right?
Yeah.
But so indoor scene, how are you going to expose and set up your camera?
If I were to set a scene up on inside, like there's so many variables, so please know that this is a very general statement.
And we're also going to have lighting, which is going to help with things.
Yeah,
that's
and a lot of the time with lighting, I'm gonna highlight the things I want to highlight. I'm gonna make the things fall off and cut that I don't want to really come to life.
Yeah,
but ultimately, I'm probably going to overexpose just a little bit inside. And this is what I mean by that. I don't have to quite worry about my highlights blowing out and those things, because unless there's a window or something like that, I have a little wiggle room, but I really have to pay attention to those shadow areas.
I would say inside there's two things that are important. Mm-hmm. And one of them is important everywhere, but shadows are really important inside or in a dimly lit outdoor scene, right? At nighttime or whatever. But shadows are super important, and then what exposure is your skin at?
Yeah, skin tone.
Those are the two things that I'm going to really, really, really be watching.
Yeah, and naturally your skin tone is probably going to be a little darker inside than it is outside. And the reason I say overexposed is that's going to protect those shadow areas that there's so much more of. Now, outside is exact opposite. Not saying that I'm going to underexpose.
No.
But I'm going to make sure that I'm exposing for skin is probably going to be a little bit higher in the exposure, but I'm going to really pay attention to the highlights, that I'm not blowing the sky out and everything just looks fake and washed out, because that doesn't look pleasant at all. And so I think that's where log really shines in those areas. And so when I'm shooting log inside, I'm just kind of being mindful that I'm pushing it a little brighter then that's probably normal, because then I can take that in post and just drop it a little bit and it just sits perfectly where I want it. Right. Yet I have the information in the shadows.
Well, like we said earlier, you always want to kind of overexpose a little bit. That way you can bring it down and it's going to clean up that image a little bit too. Yep. If you have it a little bit too dark and you're trying to raise your exposure, globally raise your exposure, you're going to introduce noise into the shot.
And that's what I see a lot when people shoot log. They're like, man, I don't know if I like log because it's just too noisy. Well, if you're shooting exposed or really underexposed a little bit, and then in post you're bringing everything up by a half stop, you're introducing all sorts of artificial noise in there that doesn't need to be there. And the opposite thing happens if you shoot a half a stop overexposed or a stop overexposed and bring that down. You're really shifting those shadows, and actually the noise is really
cleaning it up.
Yeah, you're cleaning it up. So
right. So the two things I would say to caveat, or not caveat, but to add on to what you were saying about lighting for log is that, again, it comes down to skin, right? There are all the camera does is what? Right. Captures the way the light is interacting with your scene. That's all the camera does. And the curve of the color space you're shooting in, the way that the roll off is on the highlights or whatever else, that is going to affect the way that the colors are seen, the way that, like, if your skin has a clean roll off or whatever. Yeah. So if you're going to shoot in log, I know S-Log. I don't really know Canon log, whatever, but your roll off, do you want to explain IRE? No? We'll do another video on IRE.
Exposure. Okay. I think that will be a video of itself.
Okay. Yeah, later we'll have one, but if you're shooting it, for S-Log, for skin tones, you really want to be underneath that 70 IRE for skin tones, or else you're going to get really harsh roll-offs. It's not going to look good. And that changes per scene. You talked earlier about a dimly lit scene.
You shoot dimly lit and your skin is 70 IRE.
It's going to look really weird, right? Like you're going to be more in like the 40 range usually, right? Yeah. And so just learning your camera, learning your curve, learning the curve of your color space and the gamma curve.
And every camera is different. That's why some people love every lens is different. Like the contrastiness, you got to learn those things to compensate for them. So.
Which is why you play. But the big thing I would say is when you're outside, especially, and you're trying to, get that skin to a certain level, don't go above that 70. Like that's as bright as you want to go. And if your highlights get rolled off.
And real quick, before IRE, I think most cameras have some sort of zebra setting. And so you can set your zebras to, 60 IRE or 45 or
something.
whatever.
Yeah.
And then that could be your skin tone inside. And if those zebras are on skin at 45, you're roughly in that ballpark.
Yep.
Or 40, whatever mood you're going for. That's a great way to go, okay, now I'm exposed properly.
Yeah.
And again, I rarely ever shoot my camera where I just see the log profile because it's so flat that you can't really tell those things. And the truth is my exposure is all over the place because that's such a fine adjustment where if I have some sort of, conversion on my camera,
a monitor LUT,
or a monitor on my external monitor or whatever, like that's a monitoring LUT that really lets me see what I want that final image to look like in post.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden I can put that conversion LUT on in post. And when I say it takes 10 seconds or less in post-production, it really doesn't add a whole lot.
Yeah. So we've gone over for S-Log, outdoor, indoor. When you get back to the editing suite that you have in Davinci, how are you converting that log footage into a 709?
So there's actually multiple ways that I do this, but I'm going to talk through the first couple. If you wanted to, you could literally create a node in the color, and the same thing in Adobe, like this is how you do this in Premiere. But like you could go and get that LUT from the manufacturer and put it into your computer, and you could drag that on top of that LUT, and you just took S-Log and put it into Rec 709. But now Davinci has made a really easy way that they have all those manufacturer color spaces already in there. And so you can put something called a CST or a color space transform on that LUT, and you go up to effects, put color space transform, you go in and you select, okay, I shot this in S-Log 3 and S-Gamut 3 Cine, and that your camera will tell you that.
Yeah, every camera has different profiles that you're going to shoot, and then color spaces also, right?
And then you're going to say, hey, I want that output of that to be Rec 709 Gamma 2.4
or whatever
is typically what your deliverable is.
Yeah, your output's going to be whatever your deliverable is.
That is what every LUT from a manufacturer is going to go to naturally. Yeah. So I would put in Rec 709.
So that's the way that you and I do it. When we're in Davinci, we'll go in and we have a CST node, and we'll just settle that out. And you have
and what's cool about that, if you're a Photoshop person or whatever, it's kind of like layers. That's what a node is. And so if I put that node or layer towards the end, anything above that, I still have full control over all that log footage.
Right.
And so that exposure and things. And it really allows me to have a ton of latitude to get the look that I want.
Throughout the whole image. And then you're converting all that work you just did into that 709 color space.
Yep.
There's a faster way for people who, like, that's the way we do it.
Yep.
Right? There's a faster way that we feel like you kind of degrade your image a little bit. But if your focus isn't color grading, like I would say our two focuses really are lighting and color grading. Like that's like the things that we nerd out over most. But if that's not your focus, you can go into a color managed profile or a color managed timeline when you're setting up your timeline settings, your master settings. It's automatically
going to do it for you.
And it automatically, you don't even have to do anything else. You just say, I want color managed and this output delivered to be, basically you're doing the same thing just globally, right? And so that's even a faster way. Now,
and it will do that for most manufacturers.
Yeah. So with Premiere, I know a lot of guys listen to this or gals listen to this are Premiere users still. For Premiere, you can do it the same way. You can go in clip by clip.
Listen, we will convert you over to Davinci.
We will. But there is a way. Again, people who are in Premiere their focus isn't on color.
Yeah.
Their focus is on batch editing, big editing, like
Sure.
TV, broadcast, whatever. So you can do it two ways. Again, just like you can with Davinci. You can go in clip by clip and go into your Lumetri panel, basic correction, import LUT, and then you can download from the website, Sony, Canon, whatever, their LUT that they have, their conversion LUT, have that in a folder on your desktop or wherever else, and then import that LUT onto that clip. Super time consuming, right? You can also go in, highlight all your clips, and this is the fast way. This is the way I would do it. Highlight all your clips, go to modify, interpret footage. On the bottom of that window, you can go, it says convert to Rec 709, and there's a drop-down menu, and all the Canon, Panasonic, Sony, it's all there. You click it, and all that footage you had highlighted, it's all now in Rec 709.
Yeah.
Like that's
And it's that simple. And
it
now,
takes-
now you took that, and that's why they call it a space transform. It's taking a big space and putting it into that Rec 709 finished look. It's like taking a raw photo and making it a JPEG. Now, I'm not saying it has that much dynamic range, but you know what I'm saying. There's not that much information, but that's how fast it is. And that's why I would love to encourage people to go, don't be so afraid of S-Log because you think it's time consuming in the end, because it's literally a matter of 15 seconds that can do all that for you. And so it just allows for a lot more latitude in post-production. So
Yeah. And again, that's exactly what you said. Like, don't be afraid of it. The benefit of doing that, spend that 15 seconds, is you have so much more information. That's the true benefit of log footage versus a Cine or Hyperlog Gamma profile.
Yeah. And I made one statement earlier that I want to clarify. So I said I would always shoot in S-Log.
Okay.
And a lot of I've done many things that I'm doing live streams. And it's like, please don't stream S-Log. I'm just saying, it looks horrible. I know people that do it, and it's like, please stop doing that. We talked about
Or
that.
Don't deliver an S-Log.
Yeah, don't
That's
deliver
the
an
thing,
S-Log.
too.
Like, don't deliver an S-Log. That's what it comes down to.
S-Log should never see the light of a delivery page.
But when I say shoot an S-Log, what I'm saying is, if you're so familiar with S-Log, you know how it works, you feel comfortable with it, and all of a sudden you start shooting in Cinetone, there's a lot of times where all of a sudden I realize my highlights are clipping at different areas, all of these different things. You have to like change mindsets, how you normally shoot to compare to not. Like if it was me, like what I've done in those situations is like this camera specifically, I can output that Sony LUT that they put in this camera. I can output that to my HDMI or my SDI output, send that to the live stream, and it looks phenomenal.
Yep.
Or I can even take an amazing LUT that somebody else has looked and actually create a look to send to that. And so, or something that I've made in my own production. So I think what it does is, again, you don't have to sit here and be like, oh man, I have at Cinetone, it clips at 105 or 104, or, oh, you know what I'm saying? Like now you're always constantly going, man, am I exposed properly? I'm not exposed properly. Like I feel like that's what I meant by that statement, because of this specific camera and even the FX3, they can output those space transforms that give you a finished look anyway. And usually I'm always recording in those situations, and we make a cool highlight video or something, and it allows me to have so much more to do with that footage.
Well, you can build different looks off of the same clip. And you said something just now that made me a rabbit, but you talked about not having to remember what your highlight roll off was on like a Cinetone. And I'm going to use Cinetone as an example because, again, that's what we use. But to me, it's actually easier to shoot in S-Log than it is to shoot in Cinetone, because the way that the gamma curve I was talking about earlier, the way that works and the way that interprets the footage that you're bringing in, based on your exposure. If you're overexposed, it's not like overexposed where you're losing information, but let's say you're a touch bright, you're going to get super flat.
Yep.
Is that the look you wanted? I don't know, right? And you're baking that look in. If you're normal exposure, but you want more contrasty, it's easier. But let's say you're wanting a really flat look, because there's some shows that want flat looks, and you underexpose a little bit. It's going to be really hard to get that contrast out of there without having the raised blacks and it's more work, and having to remember all the time, like, well, where do I want to expose for this? When we've had to shoot Cinetone for a few shows before for deliveries that we weren't handling the post side, and I remember the whole time we're shooting, and we're in super contrasting environments. The one I'm thinking of specifically, the whole time I'm shooting, I'm like, am I overexposed? Am I underexposed? Where should I? Is my exposure right? Like I'm always thinking about my exposure. Whereas in S-Log,
are you talking about country music?
Yeah.
Show? Oh yeah, same thing, dude. The whole time they wanted that look, and both of us were like, please no, please no. And the hardest part is in my opinion, the footage doesn't match through the entire thing, because constantly that the lighting is doosh, 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 doosh. And so how Cinetone specifically works, and a lot of these conversion LUTs work, is, you know, how it's exposed is the characteristic of the feel of that. And so you get rid of all that with an S-Log that's not baked into any of that thing. And, you know, now all of a sudden I can put that conversion LUT, and if this clip looks a little different, then I just raise the exposure by, you know, a quarter of a stop, and all of a sudden it's like, wow, everything just okay.
Well, and again, you talked about the look of the shot is based off the exposure, and why is that not the case in log? Because in log, you're controlling the contrast level.
Yep.
in a Cinetone or in a baked in look, a 709 look that's in camera that they're using as a LUT. When you're doing that, your exposure, you're baking that amount of contrast into your shot.
Well, and I would say this, like it matters in the order that this stuff happens. And I think that's why S-Log gives you so much more control. If that look is baked in already and I put that in post-production and I try to raise exposure, I try to raise saturate, all that's baked into that already.
Yeah.
Now, if I can move this baked in look down the line and I can create exposure before this happens,
100%.
all of a sudden, this isn't, all this is knowing is what it's being sent to it right before that.
Which is just one more reason to use Davinci, not Premiere.
And with all that being said, is this, we could go into this for days and hours, literally.
This is something we could talk about forever. Yeah.
Certified in, and I love it, and I can nerd out, and I'm going to be honest, like sometimes you don't use it all and you forget some of it, but man, how important it is to know some of those basics. And so what I would say is if you own a camera, I've shot Canon log and it has completely different characteristics than S-Log, C-Log and S-Log. C-Log typically, Canon's flattest profile is not close to Sony's. And so you have to learn how that works. And especially if you're a colorist, like how you grade those to get the
totally
look is completely different.
Yeah.
And so in some ways I feel like it makes you better in camera and in post-production. Yes, it does take time to learn it, but it's so worth it because we hand our footage off now with people who go, man, thank you. That looks great. That was awesome.
Yeah.
Or,
man,
hey guys,
why does
I'm
your footage
struggling
look
with
so
this
much better
shot,
than ours?
and we can have a fix for it in a couple seconds compared to like, hey, this shot just looks bad. Can you guys fix this? And next thing you know, we just spent 3 hours on one shot because everything already baked into that puppy.
Yeah.
And they probably spent more money doing that than if they would have just had us grade the entire thing in 3 hours.
Right. Whatever. Yeah. Which you could if you have, and you had the ability to shoot it properly. So the last thing I want to cover is with log, the difference between ISO and Cine EI or exposure index, because a lot of people don't understand and they're going to change their exposure index thinking that it's changing their image when it's not.
Yeah.
So do you want to go into the base?
Cameras are different a little bit. And so
I'm specifically me. I'm talking about people who have shot Sony, who shoot Sony, who ask me because
any new modern Sony camera has 2 base ISOs. So if you didn't know this, even every camera ever has been made. For example, I owned a Canon 5D Mark III, 10, 12, 13 years ago. And there's actually a base ISO for that camera.
A native ISO.
A native ISO. So you're over here and you're like, why does 160 look cleaner than 200 or 100? It's actually 160 was a native ISO that went up in increments of those ways. And so there's cleaner bases. Anyway, how these cameras work is they actually have a base ISO of 800 and then they put a dual ISO and it resets at 12,800 in S-Log. Now in Cinetone it drops to
2,000, 4,000.
100 and
I think it's 200 and 4,000.
Well, they change. I own so many cameras; they're all different.
Again, so this is why we shoot.
I literally have a cheat sheet on my camera, so when I have to do these things,
right.
But like the whole point on that is like if you always shoot your camera in one of those 2 ISOs.
There's no other option.
There's no other option.
It's not
so
like,
if you
like
change
ISO
the
ISO,
ISO,
you can change it.
You're like, ooh, it's getting brighter. Actually,
not the ISO, the exposure index.
No, so but that's what I'm saying. If I hit the ISO button in one of those settings and change it, it actually is just changing what they call the exposure index. And like I said, this could get really complicated, but really
let's dumb it down. But like, I want to explain to people why. So I just did a shoot in Tennessee the other day where this exact same thing happened. My monitor, like my external monitor, was reading. I was checking waveform. I had false color. Exposure was perfect. And then we're looking down at the monitor on camera, and it's 2 stops darker. And everybody's like, "What's going on?" I'm like, "It's right. Just trust me, it's right." And they're like, "I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's going on." I'm like, "We'll check it. If it's not right, we'll fix it. Whatever, right?" Yeah. But it was the exposure index was different. So this, like, I know people that this happens to, and so my fear is that I want to explain this so anybody who has a question knows not to change their exposure index.
And this is really specific to 2 cameras, 3 cameras.
Yeah.
Or whatever, 4 or 5 cameras.
Sony,
but like as any Cine cameras. So and I think that's when I say exposure index, like you could go change, and this I'm going to go back to ISO because people understand that, but you're really, say you're changing a gain or whatever, but your camera is just compensating for your eyesight. And so you're going, hey, I'm raising this ISO, but really all it's doing is changing the exposure index on where it's actually exposing at. So that way when it's in post-production, it's actually a little bit brighter than or a little bit less.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Like that's why
I'm going to dumb it down even more. So exposure index, what exposure index is about, you have your low ISO and your high ISO. And so for FX6, it's 640 and 12.8, right? Yeah. So let's say you're in 800 ISO. Sorry, it's 800 and 12.8. Let's say you're at 800 ISO and you have your exposure index set to 800 ISO. It's going to be a neutral or a correct exposure for what you're monitoring.
Yeah.
Right. So if you are the reason that they have exposure index in these cameras is if you are shooting a scene and you're overexposing it on purpose. A good example would have been our Restoring Dummies. It's a very moody look, right? But yet we're still exposing it properly to make sure that the look that you have is what is going to be possible to get, and that you're maintaining the black levels where you want it. You can drop your exposure index for monitoring purposes only.
Yeah, it's monitoring purposes.
It's not doing anything to the image, and it's all, if you have an external hard drive, an external monitor, it's not going to change the image on your external monitor. It's only on your on-camera monitor. It will drop the exposure, what you're visually seeing. Again, for exposure index is only for monitoring. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and again, like I said, this is confusing because then when you get it in post, it's not going to look like what your monitor looked like.
No.
It's just going to be properly exposed with a little bit of shift towards the highlights or the shadows, in order which one you wanted to preserve better.
And you always want to, you never want to in post have to lift your exposure. Again, we've said this a few times. If you're using your exposure index, use your exposure index in a way that's favoring that you're going to be overexposing.
So you can drop it in post. Like I said, this is really very confusing, and I would encourage you to go to somebody like, there's a couple of guys. Robert Machado does one of the best,
Alistair Chapman,
and then Alistair Chapman. The reason I love Roberts is he has he literally he shows you on camera exactly what it's doing, so that way he's like, this makes a lot of sense. So anyway, my point is that is confusing. That doesn't apply to anybody with not this camera. These cameras.
Well, we get asked most questions about our SFX.
What?
Oh, if you don't have it, I thought you said it doesn't apply to FX9.
Yeah, I said unless you have those few cameras.
Right, a Sony Cine camera, newer. Well, even the FS7 had.
Yeah, like this has two base ISOs, but it doesn't have the exposure index.
Right. So hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, hit us up in the comments. We can go maybe make a few videos about it.
I'll just send you to somebody else who did it better.
That's a good idea. Yeah, send us somebody who even knows better than we do. But is there anything else on log? This went longer than we planned on it, but is there anything else that you feel is important?
Yeah, and I would just say, I hope that in some ways it my encouragement, the whole reason we do this, I've told you this 1,000 times, I don't need to be busier. I don't need 1,000 things to do, but these are questions that we get asked a lot. And S-Log, in my opinion, or log footage, if you're shooting Canon, if you're shooting anything with 10-bit or above, 10-bit, 12-bit, 14, if you're shooting crazy, awesome cameras, you should be shooting in log footage to get the most out of your camera. And again, there's nothing wrong with Cinetone. When I say that, they've done a great job with that. But again, you don't want to govern your Ferrari, right?
Well, where did Cinetone come from?
Yeah, it came from the Sony Venice, but it's a log profile that they created to go into this thing. It's a transform that is perfected by the people who made the camera.
Right.
Sounds amazing, but imagine if you could actually, open that up a little bit more and create your own.
Again, like Matt's saying, again, we would obviously encourage anybody. Every time I get asked, people hey, would you ever shoot in Cinetone? I'm like, no, not unless I'm made to, right? But one thing I would say, if this still seems daunting, and you're gonna shoot in Cinetone, typically the best thing to do with any kind of a 709 look or LUT that's on a camera, really, really, really be careful with your highlights, because highlights are where those fall apart. The knee on that gamma curve is way sharper. The roll-off's not near as nice when you're shooting in a 709 LUT.
Yeah.
In camera.
And they've done a really good job on if you are shooting in that profile, like learn what a little underexposed, proper, neutrally exposed and a little overexposed, what it does to the image, because that's going to look completely different. I do want to say this, just to say this. I feel like the number one excuse I get for not shooting S-Log is, well, I got to deliver that footage like tomorrow or now. And I get that. Like, we have been on so many shoots like that people are going, hey, can you just shoot this in a Cinetone or in a Rec 709, depending on where you're shooting. They're like, hey, give us a Rec 709. Typically, I'll say, hey, can I upload that footage for you, or give me a few minutes and I'll just export that as or teach them how, because there is so much more of an advantage to that. So to me, it's not it can take away that excuse, because what you said, you can literally click a button on your timeline and I can tell anybody in that editing and they can deliver something within an hour later to get it to the news station.
Well, and I would say even when you're talking your turnaround for yourself, I would say that 80 to 90% of our projects have a week turnaround. Like we do turn around fast, and that's with us having time for grading.
Yeah, but I mean, I was on a shoot,
and audio.
We did something for, like a Wounded Warriors type of deal, where it had to be to the news station in 5 hours, and they're like, hey, that's typically where somebody's like, that's why I need Cinetone. But it's like, hey, just build that project and click on those project settings. It's already done.
Right, and you have all the information.
Yeah, you have the information. So.
Yeah, so that's all, like I said, that's all I would say. If you're shooting in Cinetone, just really learn the gamma curve.
Yeah. If there's anything I'd tell you, like, just learn it to the full extent. Like, I hope we encourage you not to just settle for just like that's the whole reason we do all this. The time. We hear this a lot. Like, you guys just overdo it all the time, and then and we laugh because we're like, maybe, but at the same time, it's also why I feel like we get a lot of compliments of, oh man, love the look of that. Hey, how'd you guys do that? Hey, what are you doing to get that look? It's just learning a little bit more how those tools work to your advantage.
What's funny to me is a lot of times when we hear that, we also hear within a week or two, like, how are you getting all these jobs? That like seem really cool, because I say all the time to like my kids and my friends that aren't in the space, I'm like, man, my cameras have allowed me to live a pretty awesome life. Like, I'm going to be able to die and say, I saw a lot of things, and it's 100% because of my cameras, because I have zero talent outside of being a camera guy. And, the reason that they've allowed that and that we get to go on those cool shoots is because we're always pushing. And it's not like I'm not smart. No one has ever accused me of being a smart person. And if I can learn this,
if we hit the camera, like rolling on the cameras before we started this, I mean, it'd be comical. People would see a lot.
Yeah. We need a GoPro in the corner. But like, if I can learn it, and especially if Matt can learn it, just kidding, Matt's smarter than I am. But if I can learn it, and if Matt can learn it, it really all it is just time. Take the time to try to learn. Just put forth the effort. And it does seem daunting, but every little piece you learn, it opens up the door to, oh, well, I can learn this. And it's like a spider web.
Yeah. And it intrigues. It makes you grow. You know how many times in our space that you get stagnant and burned out and you're just bored because you're doing the same thing over and over and over again? Like, that's ultimately what got us into color grading. Like, man, we're having a fun time doing this, but like, what if we did more,
Well, that's, we have a hard time with retainers for the fact that we get bored. Yeah. And it's retainers are awesome if you're on a business. They're kind of important, but we struggle more with retainers than we do anything else, I think, because it's gosh, well, how can we do this different? How can we make this like, you get bored doing the same thing. So you have to find new ways, which some people are great. That's the way their creativity works. I think the way ours works is that we're pushing our knowledge base, and that's what makes it like, oh, I learned this thing. Let's try this, Yeah. And that's usually what we end up doing with our retainers.
I hope if we're in this industry, any creative, we want to be better tomorrow than we were today. Mm-hmm. And that's part of this. That's all it is. And I'm not saying that like S-Log is just going to make you better. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like, hey, just those little advantages and knowledge is a why to shoot in something like that is a big advantage. And again, I'm not saying that there's never a time not to shoot in a delivered format versus another. I'm just saying like, hey, if it's scaring you, venture out a little bit.
And to go back to what we said in the lenses one, you were talking about when you buy a new lens. I am a little bit hard headed. And so I did use my 35 stubbornly on paid shoots. And Matt was really quick to say, well, don't do that on paid shoots. Like, don't necessarily test everything. Like, don't test out a new idea on a paid shoot. I probably wouldn't test out S-Log3 for the first time on a paid shoot.
Yeah.
I would experiment in your backyard, experiment in your living room. Just learn it a little bit first, and then gradually. One thing I like to say for the outdoor people, if you're doing a scene where you're out in the middle of the day because that's the only time you're out of the tree stand, that's a good time to try shooting an S-Log, because that's when the biggest thing about S-Log is dynamic range, and that's when you need dynamic range the most. I probably wouldn't try to shoot S-Log for the first time at night at the dinner table trying to talk about how the day went in the deer stand, because chances are you're going to underexpose, and then it's going to cause you a lot of problems if you don't.
This is my favorite thing. Okay, so I see this a lot. I research like crazy, you know that. And you know how many times I go look at the new, whatever, let's just say it's a red Komodo or the Raptor or whatever, and you're like, man, I have this camera. And then you go look at the footage on YouTube, and it's somebody's dead backyard with zero dynamic range, zero abilities, zero this, and they're like, it's a cool camera. I don't see a big difference. And it's like, go push the thing to the limits. Like, that's the whole point. It's like, man, if again, like, that's what log footage is going to do. It's going to allow you to see the advantages if you're actually doing it properly. And that's, I use that example because you know how many times I've went and I want to see some incredible footage from these cameras that I'm like, well, maybe not Komodo, but like the Raptor. I'm like, man, I really want to see this thing.
Unless it's from Red.
See it. And then the people that are shooting it is like, oh yeah, by the way, Guardian of the Galaxy, the new one was shot on that. And you're like, oh yeah, that's the capabilities of that camera.
That's what it can do.
And that's awesome. But it's like, why is the person over here who just got it and they're filming their little kid swinging in the background with, my point is like, man, like that's how you experiment to really, I guess, see what the capabilities are. It's like,
and looking back,
and push yourself.
I've messed up a lot of footage.
Oh my gosh.
Not footage that mattered, but I've messed up a lot of footage, right?
Yeah.
Because we go out and we try things. There's nights at 2:00 in the morning, I'm in my office setting up lights, hitting record on the camera just to see if it looks good. And half the time it doesn't, right? Because I'm trying something new.
One of the first times you and I ever, like when we first met, we met up downtown at like 1 a.m. and went
walking around downtown.
Wanted to see what it was like to shoot in low light and what we could actually do with that. I got the footage back. I'm like, this stuff is garbage. I found out the limitations of that 8-bit footage and real quick. And I also understood, like, hey, that's why you overexpose.
And that's another thing I would say too, and this is hard. I fully understand how hard this is, but find somebody who pushes you without, like Matt and I can push each other hard without degrading each other, or is that the right word? Without putting each other down. I remember when we first really got into color grading, I was like, Matt, I think I want to learn about color.
Yeah.
And Matt was like, no, we have 8-bit footage. I'm like, yeah, but I still want to learn it. He was like, eh. And then
my exact words is, I'll learn it when my camera is capable.
You said, I'll learn it when I have a 10-bit camera. That's exactly what I said. And as soon as you got the 10-bit camera, like head first, right? Audio for me, I'm learning audio now. It was, we were shooting something and then we were getting audio, and I was like, hey Matt, why am I having it wrong? And he just kind of smirked, and he wasn't being mean, but it was just like I got it, I'll take care of it. And I don't like that. And he wasn't putting me down at all. It was just that Matt has done audio for how long? Like 20 something years, like forever.
Since I was 15 years
old.
And
just knowing that, there's that much that I don't know, and Matt being able to, without diminishing my abilities, and me without Matt being able to diminish Matt's abilities, we can push each other.
It's the adage of iron sharpens iron, because at the end of the day, like, there's times where I get burned out that you'll encourage me on to get inspired or do something, and vice versa. And at the end of the day, you know how many times we get this all the time? Like, did you take that photo or did I take that photo? I mean, it's pretty hard to tell the difference.
Half the time we forget. Yeah. The only time we know for sure is if I'm in the photo or if Matt's in the photo.
Exactly. Like, it's pretty much the same product, which is fun. It's exciting, but there's also there's this constantly sharpening. And so I'm going to be honest, I didn't have that for a long time. And so you kind of feel like you're out on this ledge or whatever by yourself. And there's times where you're passionate about it and times where it goes away. And when you have the person to push you on, man, that's where it gets fun. And so ultimately, that's why we started a business.
And how many times have we been on a shoot where, let's say we're setting up for a talking head and I'll say something like, hey, Matt, what do you think about putting a camera or a light over whatever? And he's like, you know what we could do?
Yeah.
Like it sparks. Yeah. And it's the same with knowledge and in general. Like, just like, hey, Matt, I think I kind of want to learn about color grading. I did about sound design too one time. I was like, I kind of want to learn more about sound design. And it sparked something in you that you went a different direction, and it was this in color grading or in sound design or in lighting.
Oh, and one of my favorite examples, I swear we are going to finish this thing. This might be our longest one yet. It was supposed to be the shortest. But is restoring dummies. We walked into a setting where there was only one camera shoot. We didn't do any multicam stuff.
We did one.
Oh, I guess the interview.
We had a B cam.
Well, their interview. But you
didn't use it. Well, yeah, you did.
Yeah. Anyway, but it was real. That part of it, I'm not
outside
talking
of the interview.
I'm talking about that to me is where I'm proud of the B-roll. Every shot in that video, I'm like, yes, that was fun. It was cool. It was exciting. And we learned the entire way because first of all, we walked into a very well-lit LED modern shop that we made look like Pinocchio came from there, and it's not to brag about that, but it was to literally creatively do things. And it was like, hey, Aaron, what do you think about this? And we're like, dude, what if we change the temperature of that light? And I'm like, dude, let's put a ray coming in there and it'll hit that and how it comes off there. And let's turn the key down where it's a little more mysterious. And the whole time we're learning together, we were more excited about that stupid shoot. We got 6 shots done the entire day of one of the B-roll day, but it was my favorite 6 shots I've ever shot, until that moment.
Well, and one of the biggest compliments I've got on that film was about his shop. He was like, man, he has his shop lit cool. And I'm like, no, he doesn't.
It's rope lights.
It's a big LED light, right?
You know what I'm saying?
But the idea that, hey, it was believable.
Yeah.
With lighting, it's hard to make it believable.
Well, even the opening shot of that where lights coming through individual booklets and pamphlets and the history of it. And you're like, dude, I'm in an attic right now looking at some really creepy stuff that brought you instantly into the mindset.
And it was a really boring office.
And from the rest of that time, you're just invited into intrigued by the story. And that was just fun to be a part of. And that would not have happened by myself or by yourself or whatever.
No, it won't. And I think that's one of the really cool things about being on shoots together is that you can take ideas off of each other and you build it. Rarely we've had 3 times ever shooting a project ever in the past.
Every time you say that is when we have another one.
Well,
we go.
We got some pretty important shoots coming up. We'll have something, but we very not very often or hardly ever has there been a shoot where we disagree. We were like, no.
Usually it's pride and stubbornness.
And it's all. I would say it's always opinion.
Yeah.
Always, every single time it's been opinion. But most of the time, if let's say that I'm setting something up and Matt's like, hey, what do you think? It's always, what do you think about putting a light there? Or what do you think about doing whatever? I'm like, that's awesome. We could also. And so it's building. Yeah. It's not changing, but you're building on the scene. And our best sets have always been when we were almost giddy because we're like, oh, we could do this.
Yeah.
And that's the funnest part. So have somebody that pushes you that is just as passionate as you are about it.
Yeah.
And watch your work grow.
And that's the whole point of this entire video of S-Log is all it's doing is pushing you to that next level of understanding a little bit more what you can do in post-production. To me, it excites me and allows me to want to keep doing this. It doesn't, it can be overwhelming, but that's why I'm like, don't just dive into it and be like, oh no, I'm discouraged and get out of it. Find a passion project that you can figure it out with. Do something. And I know that we don't have time for that, but every once in a while you have to do those things to reset and to keep going.
Well, and if you're a hobbyist, it's better. If you're a hobbyist, then that means that you have more time to do that. We have to, this is how we make our money. So we have less time for passion projects, but we should probably end the episode because my camera is saying media near full. So
64 minutes.
That's a long one. But yeah, at the end of the day, like Matt said, progression.
Yeah.
That the whole point is progression. S-Log, if it takes you to the next level, use it.
And use Davinci.